All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us today for our conversation on finding alpha and fighting for cures. So today we're going to have a very different conversation. It's a multi-layered conversation where we're going to talk about healthcare, but we're going to take it from two really different angles. So from the investing in public security standpoint, we have Michael Taylor. And for those of you who don't know Mike, he's 2 decades worth of running some of the top healthcare funds in the hedge fund space. And then on the other side of things, we have Victoria Velotzko, who is Senior Vice President of Mission at Susan G. Komen. And Victoria is going to be shining the light on how Komen looks to award research grants. So they're investing in cures in a very, very different way. And then, of course, guiding the conversation today is our very own Michael Green. And so before we get started, a few housekeeping items. The conversation is meant to be entertaining and it's meant to be informative. It is not meant to be investment advice. So do your own research, but make sure you're utilizing the Q&A function down at the bottom of the screen. There's a Q&A button, and we'll try and incorporate any questions that the audience has into the conversation and then try and leave room at the end for a devoted Q&A section. But let me hand it over to Mike to guide the conversation.
Thank you, Brian. Well, it's great to be here. As most of you know, I have been friends with Michael Taylor for a very long time. And Victoria, you and I just met, and I've learned how to pronounce your name. But we're going to focus, as Brian highlighted, on a couple of different dynamics. One is the component of the Susan G. Komen Foundation's mission, how you approach that from the standpoint of research. And then I'd love to speak with Mike, kind of taking what you've identified as the approaches that you're using within the Susan G. Komen, and think about how we interact the fundamental work that you guys often do with the market-related dynamics around investing. And then if you're tolerant of it, Victoria, Mike and I will probably riff on some macro issues as we think about where we are in the markets today. But I'm incredibly excited that the two of you get to work together, because this gives Mike Taylor the excuse to wear pink jackets and plunging necklines. So we're in very good shape on that. Yes, there we go. Thank you, Mike. I'm not going blind anymore. Okay. So Victoria, again, you are the SVP of Mission, but from my reading of it, one of the most important things that you've done is you've assembled a research group that, as you were describing it earlier, is very patient-centered around the dynamics of both identifying cures and treatments for cancer. And maybe you could give us some quick background, because you don't come from a scientific background, but you've facilitated the building of this extensive panel of experts and projects that you guys are working on.
Well, thank you first for having me. I just want to say, for the record, I was promised a participation in a Speedo, so I'm a little disappointed that didn't happen on the call today. But I'm delighted to be here with you, especially since it's Breast Cancer Awareness Month. So it's a really important month for us here at Susan G. Komen. The word awareness is pretty interesting because, as all of you know, there's probably no one on the face of the planet who's not aware of the topic of breast cancer. What we really need is action. And that's what you're pointing to today. One of the actions that we take as an organization is investing in biomedical research. We're actually the second largest funder of breast cancer research in the world. We're second only to the US government, which, much like that other company's tagline, that means we probably have to try a little harder to get to number one. But part of what our investment strategy is, and has been for the past 40 years, is to provide that fuel to find the new understanding about breast cancer that can inform new treatments and new technologies, as well as new healthcare delivery models that will provide access to care to all. It's really important that we're looking at those three things, because it's not enough just to create that new therapy. It's important that we ensure that all people can access what we've put into the market. I know our conversation today is mostly about research, but I just want to touch on, those are the two other important arms of the Komen mission besides research, is providing access to care through our patient care services. We're also a really big voice of public policy to ensure that we're breaking down those barriers to care and ensuring access. But I'll get back to your first question, is how do we do what we do to invest what is now about $1 billion that we've invested in biomedical research. And you are right, I don't myself have a scientific background, but what's important for us as we're making these investments is to keep the ultimate beneficiary of research at the center of all we do, and that's the breast cancer patients. So voices and perspectives like mine who are looking for improved therapeutics, reducing the risk of recurrence and ensuring long life, that's really important to the conversations about our strategy. But who's making the ultimate decisions about our strategy and how we invest is our board of scientific advisors. We've done a great job of bringing in the leading voices of breast cancer research from academic institutions around the country and frankly around the world. We have the cancer center directors of the leading centers that you know in this country advising us, the chiefs of medical oncology at Stanford, the head of the Vanderbilt Cancer Center working with us. And we also work with a team of more than 60 leading scientists from a variety of disciplines. Those are known as our Komen scholars. And these bodies of world-class leaders help us craft the strategy and help us pick the winners. At Komen, we also have built a pretty sizable team of PhD scientists that we've recruited from these leading centers to come in and ensure that once we make investments, that the scientists who are working on these projects are making progress and are utilizing our funds to the best possible outcomes. So working with us, you're picking the best of the best and ensuring that the investment of your donation is really stewarded properly. And we're really proud of the accomplishments we've made.
So if I look at this past 18 months, right, this has been an unfortunate introduction for most Americans to, science, particularly in the form of a viral outbreak. Now, a virus is a little bit like cancer in that it captures and effectively forces the body to reproduce its own genetic material at the expense of what the body would normally want to do, right? So you're reproducing tons of viral load. When you think about cancer, is there a similar framework in terms of how cancer works, that it's either capturing or taking over aspects of the body's own immune system response or the body's own cells to act against the body's best interests? Is that a reasonable way to start approaching the question of kind of what is cancer and what are we trying to understand or solve?
So I know my co-panelist, Mike Taylor, has a very specific interest in the role of the immune system and virology and breast cancer, but I'll go first, then Mike, I'm going to defer to you.
Perfect, yeah.
The genesis of cancer is a really big question that we have. How does one renegade cell in the body go awry and replicate out of control and not listen to the same biological instructions that other normal cells have? Still a huge area of discovery for us in cancer to understand all of those mechanisms by which cancer starts and spreads and evades existing treatments. But the role of the immune system is huge, and there's a lot of attention now and investment on how the role of harnessing and empowering your immune system can help to arrest cancer of all kinds. My colleague is going to say a lot more about immunotherapies and the immune system, but what I will say for solid tumors like breast cancer, 20 years ago when I started in the field, the idea of immunotherapy was not very thought of as useful for solid tumors like breast cancer. That has changed dramatically. So I'm going to turn it over to my co-expert on the panel who's going to talk more about that.
Thank you so much.
Before we do that, I want to make sure to introduce Mike properly in this context, right? And so this is, my personal experience with tumors. My wife experienced a thyroidectomy with tumors on nodules on her thyroid. Mike, you've had experience with autoimmune disorders in the past several years that have affected your health. You're now coming out of that, which is one of the reasons I'm so excited to finally be able to begin to work with you after years of you and I talking about it. But maybe you can explain a little bit about what Victoria was referring to as you talk about this idea of what is immunotherapy? What does that actually mean in the context of not a viral treatment, right? But an attempt to harness your own body to fix effectively problems that your body is having.
Thank you so much, first of all, for having me. I'm Mike Taylor, You know me, but the rest of the world doesn't. I'm probably the best known name you've never heard of in healthcare management. And I've run healthcare money for over the past 20 years, mostly in hedge funds. And I've built several teams, and we've invested in and investigated just about every single drug, including cancer drug in development for the past 20 years. And that's the ones that succeeded, and more importantly, the ones that failed. The unsung failures that are out there that you never hear about are extremely instructive as to what will work and what won't work moving forward. And unfortunately, there's never an encyclopedia out there for the world to view as to terrible ideas by biotech 101, you know. So there's none of that. And that's what my team of people and myself sort of bring to that table, is that 20-year perspective and more of what has worked and what has not worked, and in this case, in cancer. So that's sort of my background. But moving on to immuno issues along with breast cancer and cancer in general. Cancer is essentially a break in surveillance where the immune system fails to surveil and take out this single cell that starts to break away. And for the most part, it's a single cell that is designated to go quiescent, meaning to turn off and go to sleep, meaning it's an older cell, one that already has damaged genetic material. And that's what happens to human cells later in life, especially. They go into a quiescent state where they go to sleep, but especially in areas of growth like breast, prostate, and other areas of the human body where there's high replication, they have signals to keep them alive, to proliferate. And sometimes with the wrong genes in your body, just through inheritance and also through exposure to just common radiation or just mutation, you can get enough mutations to propagate a cell forever, and it keeps going. And that's when the immune system would step in and clear it out, because that cell will no longer look like other cells, and your immune system very quickly will tag it. And then it's a race, a lot like a virus that you brought up earlier. It's a race of your immune system trying to capture all of the rogue cells before it gets out of hand. And when it does not work out well, we call it cancer. And then it moves on to progress through the body, stage 1, stage 2, 3, and become transient throughout all your tissues in your body. And I can go on and on and on for hours, so I'm sorry.
I know you well, and I know that's true because I know you love the science component to it. But effectively, like the way that you're introducing this, of course, obviously causes my brain, because I don't spend a lot of time on this sort of stuff, but it forces my brain to start thinking about it in the form of the new information or the new thinking that's being applied to it. And so, Susan, you brought up the idea of a solid tumor in the form of breast cancer. And Mike, you brought up the idea of fast replication, effectively parts of the body that change their genetic material or re-energize their genetic material on a fairly regular basis. The most obvious one there would be something like your skin cells, which are constantly shedding and replacing. And this would be one of the reasons under your theory that effectively a melanoma would be one of the most aggressive forms of cancer, right? That it's a type of cell that is very quickly replicating, that is changing. And so effectively, this is something I was unaware of. That's a characteristic of breast cells then, for example, that they are frequently replaced. It's relatively new and continues to reproduce throughout your life. So as you age, the risk of that reproduction becomes higher. Is that a fair assessment, Victoria?
Perhaps. So you're talking about epithelial cells, right? That turn over and regenerate often throughout the life. It's complicated, and I wish the roadmap toward the initiation of cancer and progression was really just about cell turnover. And Michael, I'm gonna look to you as the card-carrying virologist to keep me honest, right? There are so many things that happen across the life course that impact your susceptibility for cancer. It's not just the body's own natural processes, but it's every exposure that you had along your life. This is really hard to understand. Michael talked a little bit about, exposure to radiation as being one of those environmental factors that could help introduce that cell damage that could put you on the way to a cancer diagnosis. But environmental factors include everything from what you eat to how much you exercise, how much sleep you get. And all those factors can help your body accumulate the damage in this natural process that could put you on the road to cancers of any kind. There's also what Michael alluded to, which is your inherited gene mutations. Everyone all knows about the Angelina Jolie gene. I can go wax poetic about that, about how we shouldn't get our healthcare advice from People magazine, but at least to put, conversation into the marketplace about the importance of family health history. All these combinations of factors, whether it's genetic and heritable mutations or heritable issues, or what you've experienced across your life course, all of this can play a role in the generation of breast cancer. And you also mentioned age, unfortunately. One of the leading risk factors for breast cancer, at least, is number one, being a woman, and number two, getting older. At least number two is inevitable, right? We're all going to get older, and it increases your risk. So I'm going to go back to my circular logic. The getting older is exactly what you say. The older you get, the more your body has been through these natural processes, the more susceptible you are to there being an error in that process. And again, this accumulation of the environmental factors over your life can put you on the road to a cancer.
And before Mike jumps in, I just wanted to hit on that important dynamic, because typically when we use phrases like radiation, right, that tends to be a very scary idea. But Brazil nuts, for example, carry a degree of radiation. Bananas carry a degree of radiation, right? And I'm not suggesting that bananas cause cancer, but
cell phone, right? Your cell phone has a degree.
Cell phone has components of it, et cetera, right? And again, none of these are enough to be a definitive driver of cancer or mutations in the way that, say, exposure to polonium or to plutonium, would. But in terms of those minor doses, they do accumulate damage, the sun damage to your skin, et cetera. So all those things are adding up over time. And this is part of what you're describing on the diagnosis and the awareness component, is an area that I'm actually spending a lot of time on in markets, which is effectively, you're just trying to say, look, what are the initial conditions? How old are you? How much exposure have you had? What has your diet been like? What has your exercise been like? These are all components of risk factors, the Angelina Jolie, gene, right, et cetera. These are all components that effectively help us to understand the initial condition of the body, which then helps us understand the stochastic probability of an event occurring. Is that?
And, that's telling us the why this might have happened. But the bigger piece of the puzzle when we're looking at the research enterprise is to answer the question as to how. How are these mechanisms of cancer progression actually working? Because when you know the mechanism of action, that gives you a target to treat. When Michael talked about all the individual biological factors that go in to the life of the cell cycle, the biology of a cell, that gives you a roadmap for a lot of ways to address the cancer, to attack the cancerous cell. It's not just one roadmap in there to turn it off. There are a variety of roadmaps and a variety of targets that we can go in there to stop cancer in its tracks, to stop it from starting in the first place, or even to arrest its progression. We don't want to get to stage 4. We don't want to get to stage 3. How can we stop that? And that's where I think, the mother lode of a lot of research discovery is looking at. There's still a lot of work on the, why is it happening? But the how is it happening is really important too. Michael, I'm going to let you jump in because I know.
Please, yes.
You have a lot to, you got a really good.
You covered a lot of the territory here. As we talked earlier, it is largely a surveillance issue. And I wanted to state that age is the problem, yes, that ends up driving it. But for our listeners to understand that it's simply the number of replications. It's going to be mistakes made during replication. And breast happens to be turned on and off a lot. For instance, every month with a woman's cycle, all those cells get revved up over and over and over again every month throughout their life. And so it's on, off, on, off, on, off. And so they're dividing and then retrace, divide and retrace, get revved up and go back. And so it's this constant cycle. There's really not much you can do about it, and it's important for women to have that. But it is the replication errors that accumulate and then problems come about.
Now, part of the dynamic when you introduce this idea of there's so many different factors that play in and there's so many different mechanisms that play in is, one is there's this issue of surveillance that is, as Mike points out, breaking down within the body where the body doesn't necessarily hit it. And so the science and research and medical care, one of the tools that is available is increased diagnosis and early detection, right? And so when you think about the advances that are happening there, I mean, Victoria, it feels from a layperson's perspective that in many ways, we've been talking about this. You mentioned the Susan G. Komen has been one of the largest funders for the past 40 years. It feels bizarrely like cancer is more common today than it was before. Like if you were to assess that statement, is it because we've improved diagnosis so much, because we've raised awareness of it so much? And also, Mike brings up the idea of just age in terms of we've also expanded how long we live. And so the idea of dying from breast cancer or being afflicted by breast cancer is certainly enhanced if you don't die during childbirth, for example, right? So where do you think we stand in terms of that matrix of higher frequency, either because of environmental exposures or good higher frequency, which is just tied to more people surviving to the right age, and increased diagnosis to help us identify it and treat it earlier?
I think you answered the question right on. I think your statement is the right one. We are seeing more early detection and diagnosis, which is a good thing. So raising awareness and having people actually being diagnosed accurately with breast cancer has been a good thing from the awareness movement. But you also touched on that we actually have an aging population. The baby boom is still happening, and those folks are now getting into the age where breast cancer and other cancers are more prevalent. So as the population ages, we have more people in the US who are in that age group. You're going to see the absolute number of breast cancer diagnoses go up. The good news is, even though that absolute number is going up, the survival rate has also been going up. We've reduced mortality from breast cancer by more than 40% now since we started as a movement 40 years ago. That's the good news, that we're doing better, but there's still a lot of work left to be done. You talked about increasing incidence around the world, and this is where it gets really interesting. There's a lot of mythology back in the early days that certain ethnic and racial groups had a less prevalence of getting breast cancer, maybe because of their diet or their genetic makeup. I'll speak from my experience of working on breast cancer in China, where it was thought that women of Asian descent had a less chance of getting breast cancer. We're seeing a lot of that change. In recent years, the incidence of cancer, specifically breast cancer, is exploding in these countries. And the question and the debate is this about environmental factors, about pollution? Is it about the influence of Western diet? Or is it, as you say, that early detection and diagnosis is becoming more common and we're diagnosing what's already there? Lots of questions to be answered about incidence, for sure.
Mike, when you think about that dynamic, and so, Victoria brings up the very positive outcome of reduced mortality. If you were to address that vector of where that improvement is happening, is it happening because we're improving the treatments for stage 4 cancer fighting? Or is it happening because we're getting fewer people at stage 4 when we first identify it, right? Effectively, we're hitting it at stage 1, stage 2, where there's a greater probability of success, and the treatment options have expanded at the front end of the curve versus the tail end of the curve. How would you think about those two vectors?
Well, certainly diagnosis is the best part to everything that's going on, because the earlier you get to it, the better you can treat it. And so far as the cases going up, I believe a lot of that has to do, yes, aside from the age dynamic of an aging population, we also have tabulation, meaning that in the US and other countries, Western world, you have to write a cause of death. And, if you look 50 years ago, they didn't really put that down so much. And so now we actually can get to what is the cause of death, what is the pathology, and there's a big record for it now, especially in the US and Western nations. I'm sorry, what was your point you were trying to, you asked me?
I've forgotten the point too, but no, so the question I was asking was, when I think about the dynamics of diagnosis versus stage 4 treatments, right?
Yes,
the
of course.
vectors of those two, have we made the same sort of progress with stage 4 treatment that we've made with diagnosis, for example?
Well, diagnosis has just been an amazing outcome. And I have to thank Susan Komen Foundation for improving that awareness and getting those women in there to get scanned, because it's changed millions of lives. And that's incredibly meaningful. But so far as the treatment, what has gotten a lot better is the science behind the mechanism of action for breast cancer. There's many different variations of breast cancer now that we really didn't think about 30 years ago, and including driver mutations, or a simple mutation that ends up driving the cancer. And there are drugs out now, many different varieties, many not even made for specifically breast cancer, that can treat breast cancer. And now we have the technology to instantly take a biopsy, get a genotype done in 48 hours, and actually have incredible important information as to how you should be drugged. Will this drug work? Will that drug work? What is the right combination? There are algorithms now that all the doctors play by based upon the genomics of your biopsy. And I think that is what has really changed the better outcomes, because you have a lot of females, cancer patients, that are being treated appropriately. Before, it was platinum and a heck of an awful time. And that may not have been best for you, but now we know we have a pretty good idea what is best for most patients, so we can treat them appropriately. So their quality of life has dramatically improved, and the outcomes have dramatically improved. And part of that is just, fitting the right key into the right lock.
Mm-hmm. So that's a really important distinction when we talk about diagnosis, right? I mean, it's one thing to walk into your doctor's office and have your doctor say, hey, you have cancer. And it's an entirely different experience to walk into the doctor's office and have the doctor be able to say, you have this very particular type of cancer for which there is a very specific treatment that has a much higher success rate than flooding your body with toxic chemicals or effectively trying to kill all the cells in the process, right? I mean, the most extreme version, unfortunately, Victoria highlighted it before, is, a mastectomy, where you are removing all of those cells to basically get to the point that you cannot have them replicate. Today, what you're highlighting, Mike, is that the ability to identify a better key to the lock is really critical to the success that we're experiencing in reducing mortality and improving long life treatments, right? Because in many cases, we can't cure it, but we can create conditions in which the body can effectively stabilize the condition and lead to a life that is unchanged in a lot of ways.
A very good life.
Yeah.
And what we'll see, though, in the very near term, as in starting next year, we're going to start to see meaningful diagnostics change in America, at least, where some companies have enabled a blood-based testing for 100 markers or more, looking for these sort of cancers in a diagnosis environment. So you can find out very quickly, even if you're not symptomatic or you're very early stage, we can find out what it is. And then right from there, we get an idea on how to treat it. I think that all the science is going to go to earlier and earlier detection. I envision a world in the US in the very near term, as in within the next 5 years, where every individual at 40 years old is going to get an annual markup where they start searching for the cancer signals, and not through a body scan, but simply through a blood test. And that is new. There's a few companies that are working on it, and I'm very interested in all of them. But it's going to change everything. We'll see way more cancer diagnoses. I'm not sure about the false positives, meaning that some people do have a little bit of cancer that we think that they have some cancer signal, and it resolves because your immune system does take care of it. And so you're asymptomatic and it never turns into a problem. But on the other end, in many cases, it does. And so the diagnostics are going to change dramatically in the near term, and it's going to be a wonderful thing for the US. And hopefully Europe will get on board too.
Victoria, you look like you want to add something to that conversation.
Michael, I am so passionate about this issue. And I am so excited about what he just talked about with the emerging technologies about blood tests that we also call liquid biopsies. Mammography is still, the gold standard that we have for breast cancer early detection, but it's still based on, 1960s technology. And sometimes, by the time something is seen on an image, it's in a fairly advanced stage. When we are also at Komen investing in the idea of blood tests or saliva tests that could give us an earlier possible diagnosis with less invasive needs for patients. The other important part about technology is what you talked about, not only in diagnosis, but also monitoring the effectiveness of treatment through liquid biopsy. This is really important, especially for patients living with stage 4. And I just want to share with your viewers, stage 4 cancer for breast cancer is incurable. Someone whose cancer has progressed to that stage will be in treatment for the rest of their life. And so that constant need to be monitored, to have biopsies, that's really difficult for a patient. If they can do a blood test or a saliva test to monitor their response instead of a surgical procedure, that would be game-changing for this group of patients and really important. So we share the excitement too about this emerging technology. Also looking at new imaging modalities, things like AI that can help to diagnose breast cancer better than the naked eye. We've made some investments in that as well. All of this would be amazing for patients.
And this explains, what you're highlighting with this component. I've never heard the phrase before of liquid biopsies, though. So this highlights the importance of effectively blood testing type systems and the diagnostic tools that exist around this. Now, Mike, this creates a great jumping off point that we move from the science, which most people in your situation will have a reasonable, who are investing in the space, will have a reasonable understanding of the mechanism. So typically have a science background of one form or another. You yourself were actually a scientist working in a research lab. You actually went through the process of drug discovery, drug filing through the FDA before you transitioned to managing assets. We're all glad you did that, because my guess is anything you designed would probably kill the person who took it, but you're a phenomenal investor. Slowly. It's a chronic condition living with Mike Taylor and his insights. But so when you think about that next leap, right? What's the difference between understanding the science and understanding how to make investments? Victoria is very focused almost in a VC space, right? Is this a promising technology? Is this a promising investment? But now you're going into the secondary market and putting money to work, trying to decide, is it a more promising technology than people think? Or is there a different way that you think of distinguishing what's a good investment versus a bad investment in a secondary market?
That's an unbelievably astute question.
Well, I'm an unbelievably astute guy, but that's okay, we'll go forward.
I have never, so drugs get designed, developed, crafted off of a whiteboard to go into humans way before we understand all the science. If we understood all the science, we'd be able to get these drugs right, but we don't. And so we have a thesis, and it's never, ever going to be fully baked. I mean, these things take 20 years to understand a mechanism of painstaking work. And so what you do is take the big pieces of it, that this is how I think it works. What targets in this mess are druggable? Because many things are not terribly druggable, meaning getting into the cell and sticking to an enzyme or some sort of signaling protein. Some of them cannot be drugged because they function for neurons or something. So we'll give you this drug and all of a sudden you go blotto up here, but your breast cancer is gone. Great. So that's not a drug that can move forward. So we're taking the leap when we're developing drugs that we know enough about the science to say this will probably work. And then it's really a matter of the dosing and toxicity. Can we dose it to a window of efficacy without being too toxic as to render it useless in the real world? And that's always the battle. But this is part of the reason why drug development is so historically risky, and is because the fail rate was very high, meaning that we didn't really know the science entirely. So we're taking a stab here, and there was some risk. But I will submit that in my tenure over the past 10 years, science has exploded, and meaning exploded in a good way. The ability to design customized animals, mice and so forth like that take on much more of the human physiology has literally genetically modified their physiology to be much more human-like. We can figure out which drugs are going to be toxic, not toxic, at a very quick rate and with very high fidelity. And so it's really just a gigantic screening tool to find out what is intolerable. And that's new, and it's changed everything, where the drugs, the fail rate in drugs now has gone way, way down in the past 10 years. And it's really a culmination of the science, the modeling, the AI, and the number of machines that do all the work instead of humans pipetting everything left and right. We have a lot of machines. So you got 100 times the work done. And with all that together, we get a much higher hit rate. And this is why we're really seeing an explosion of new drugs now coming out, especially for breast cancer, but most other cancers too. And in fact, many cancers you never even heard of that we couldn't even treat before, we can now treat with a whole variety of drugs. And there's way more to come. We are truly in a golden age for
so the way
science and cancer research.
Yeah, the way you're describing this reminds me of another industry that went through a similar process, right? Which is oil, right? So if I go back to the 1940s and 1950s, or even into the 1970s, the success rate of drilling an oil well was relatively low, right? You needed to find a giant field, and you needed to find a giant structure in order to have success in going after that deposit. With the advent of shale, the real innovation was the horizontal drilling, the ability to target more effectively smaller deposits, et cetera. It turned it into almost a manufacturing process, which at the time, a lot of people looked at and said, oh, this is going to be fantastic for the economics of the business. It, of course, ended up being completely disastrous because it created a treadmill that we were effectively on. Do you think there's a similar dynamic at play in investing in pharmaceuticals and healthcare, where we're pretty far down the path? I mean, most estimates would suggest in the United States that healthcare is somewhere in the mid-20s in terms of spending as a fraction of GDP. Not that much opportunity for growth in terms of size. Does it become a market that really is a function of identifying those who are targeting this efficiently, or the success rates are higher that makes them a better investment? Or is it a random luck of the draw of they happen to figure out a target that works really well in a particular application? Or is there something totally else that factors into the process beyond the science of selecting good investments in the healthcare space?
Well, in the past, you saw that a brute force approach could work. I spent some time at Merck, for instance, and Shearing Plow and others. Well, Merck bought Shearing Plow, so people won't even know what that is. Anyway, Merck had this super secret high security warehouse, a vault, literally a vault. Humans weren't allowed in. It was all robots that would function inside of this to meticulously take out their small organic compounds that they had, basically pills, and it was their sample, and they had millions and millions and millions and millions of variants of pills that they had crafted for everything. And so you pull up this protein, oh, it works for migraine, whatever it's involved. Okay, let's stick it in our computer and see how many things in our warehouse are druggable against this target, and we'll start doing that. And so they did a real brute force approach to, here's a target, we already have molecules sitting in our warehouse. We don't even know what those molecules do. We just made them all. We just made zillions of them, so we have everything. And that has been working less and less because the science has moved so quickly. So before it used to be, 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration. Well, now it's about 50-50. In order to be really, really good at science, you have to be extremely smart. And I don't mean smart like, oh, I can figure stuff out. You have to be able to process an incredible amount of information. The amount of information coming out now versus 10 and 15 years ago on a daily basis about scientific innovation, we figured out how this works, how that works. It is just parabolic how much information is plowing out. And what has happened largely with the pharma companies is that they had a different brute force approach. They didn't really have to stack it full of the smartest people that they could possibly find. And so now I believe pharma is actually at a bit of a disadvantage from these nimble, smaller companies that are jam-packed with a handful of extremely smart people that can figure things out faster. And this is why pharma keeps turning around and buying and buying and buying these smaller biotech companies, because that's where the brains are. They're there with the idea and the newest generation of people who are using all the modern tools to get to work. And all the pharma companies are just simply playing catch up. And it's not really simply playing catch up. Everybody is extremely bright. There is no doubt. It's just the ability to process an incredible amount of information is the real difference in being a good scientist versus an exceptional scientist. And that really wasn't the case 20 years ago, because everybody could process the amount of information that was coming out. Now very few can. I cannot possibly keep up with the literature like I used to. It's literally 8 times the amount of reading on a daily basis. There are not enough hours in the day to possibly keep up with the amount of information coming out.
So if you
I honestly don't have a good answer to how to survive that. But I've come to the determination it is not humanly possible. So I suppose what has happened is that individuals have become more and more and more segmented and siloed into, well, I don't just do cancer, I only do breast cancer, and that's it. That's what I do because there's so much information to process. That's all I possibly can do.
And so when you think about it within that context, right? So that knowing a little bit about your investment process, there's the 2 vectors of scientific expertise and knowledge and understanding. You mentioned, for example, effectively your negative history database, right? The idea of what doesn't work, that becomes really important. And I certainly find as I age as an investor and as a human being, that one of my primary skill sets is being able to say, yeah, that's not right. That's not going to work, right? That becomes very valuable as a resource. It can also be limiting, right? Because it can blind you to things that open. But when you think about what you actually do from an investment framework, one of the things that I love about the way that you approach investments is you're not actually asking necessarily, is it better science? Is this company's science better than that company's science? You actually start asking a different question, which is who owns this thing? Maybe you can talk with me a little bit about what that means to your investment process.
Well, who owns this and who owns the IP or who made the IP is extremely important. And it's frequently overlooked, especially by the dynamic of benchmarking and things like that you and I have discussed many, many times. But what I tend to look for in the drug space, I look predominantly for, I'm always scanning for something that is very, very different. And I don't mean just like, oh, wow, it's purple. I mean something that is materially profound. And we've been in this fortunate world now that, 10 years ago, there were 2 kinds of drugs, a pill and a biologic that you could inject. And even that was relatively new. And now there are 8 to 10 different methods to deliver drugs, whether it's, silencing RNA, it's messenger RNA, it's a viral vector gene therapy that can go directly, for instance, into a tumor, or ones that can work in the stem cell tissues of your bone marrow. And And then we have multiple antibodies where you have many of them attached together with different targets so that you can recruit certain things together, like a white blood cell recruited to the antigen all at the same time. So you're getting the right white with the right cancer cell stuck together. And what does that do? These are all new things that are being in the clinic right now. And there's just a dozen of new mechanisms to get a drug to the site and make a meaningful change. That was not the case 10 years ago. And for the most part, that was not the case 5 years ago. All of these have really spawned in the past 5 years, where it went from, on the whiteboard 10 years ago to actually in humans into clinical development now. And that's why I'm stating very confidently that we are looking at a profound explosion of innovation and treatments for patients. But what I'm generally looking for is a mechanism that is materially different, because all of those pieces and parts that I just talked about, they all have different flavors. There isn't one type of mRNA. There isn't one type of silencing RNA or one viral vector gene therapy. There's a million different variants. I worked on some of them in the laboratory, the pioneering efforts for this 25 years ago. That's how long it took to get there. But there's all different flavors, and those discrete differences between these can make a profound difference, partially in the ownership as to who owns it, who has the IP, how can you make money from that, how can you hold on to the value. And then the other part is the brain trust that is also around that technology, because some are better supported by a number of people than others.
So yeah, please, Victoria, I was going to ask you exactly that. And I wanted to hit on, so 20 years ago when I used to do single stock, a lot of the focus within medical, and in particular pharmaceutical, was the idea of what is the pathway, right? How does something get in? This is a novel pathway to get something into the cell. Mike's describing something quite different, a much broader array of things, not just getting past the lipids that allow penetration into the cell itself, but the mechanisms of targeting individual cells, et cetera. I'm sorry. And so when you think about this type of innovation that Mike is highlighting, do you see the same wave of innovation coming? Are you, like, if I look forward 5 years, is it like we're going to recreate everything we've known, 10x over, or is there are we more limited in our responses?
Oh, I'm going to vote for not being very limited in our responses. Yeah. I don't think, to go back to your earlier analogy about the oil industry, and I was wondering if you were asking, like, have we reached the critical mass of what we know? And my answer would be no, that there's still a lot that we don't know, and still a lot of opportunity for innovation, new thinking. Mike talked about the need on the road to this idea of precision medicine. And that's what we're talking about here, getting the right drug to the right cancer patient at the right time by knowing really deeply the makeup of that person and that person's cancer. And we're learning a lot that, 40 years ago, we thought breast cancer was one disease. Now we know it's a collection of diseases that presents in a lot of different ways. And that gives the idea, or the scientists who are developing drugs, so many new avenues to explore. So I would say the opportunity for innovation is still fairly endless. You were talking a little bit about drug delivery methods. This is really critical, especially when we're talking about outcomes for patients. We need to find new delivery methods, whether it's through nanotech or through vectors or through other things, that will deliver that drug to the cancer while sparing the cells around it. Really, really important. So I think there's a lot of technology opportunity in terms of the delivery method that's left to learn. One of the biggest questions that we're investing in as an organization is understanding when all of these things come together for patient good. We understood the delivery method, we understood the target, but yet the breast cancer still outsmarts the very best that we have, and people go on to have recurrence and metastasis. That's still one of the biggest scientific questions that we need to answer. And Michael is right. There's been a lot of new therapeutics on the market in just the past few years that are addressing this very question, but I don't think we fully answered it yet. The other point that you made that I want to also just comment on from a Komen's perspective, It's an interesting investment strategy when you consider, are you focusing on investing in the project or investing in the person? And we do a little bit of both. There's a lot to be said for giving investment to what Michael described, this brain trust that's around these ideas and these teams, and from your perspective, these companies that are generating this really groundbreaking thinking and these new ideas. You can invest in that team, or at least we do. I'll speak for myself. We also invest in individual projects, but we at Komen also invest in those really incredible thinkers, and to give them the funding to be creative and to come up with new ideas. That balance is really important to us. The sure bets, but also, those groundbreaking, more risky ideas as well. Super important for us.
So when I try to translate this into the opportunity set, and I brought up shale in particular, because that was an area where there was a little bit of a surprising outcome, right? Where it was presumed that by moving to a factory type model, we'd end up with a far more profitable outcome. Mike, as you think about this dynamic of becoming narrower and narrower in the focus, particularly as it relates to drugs, does that hurt economics ultimately from a company standpoint, or does it change? You were highlighting this dynamic earlier of, does it change the underlying characteristics of where you want to invest, right? Do you want to try to buy the pre-IPO company? Do you want to buy the company that has IPO'd and is ready to be acquired at some point? How do you think about it from the standpoint of turning this into the economics from an investor standpoint?
Well, so far as waiting for it to go and become a public company, usually I will know about the technology and the progress well before the IPO stage in a company, because they usually work on these things for a number of years, and I'll see it at medical meetings and things like that over time. And if not even that, we'll be talking about it, because anything very interesting within my sphere of investors, we all constantly, we're all geeky science dudes, all right? And we just talk about data, this is amazing, and this is our obsession, this is what we do. So we'll know a lot about it before that sort of IPO. You asked a really, really good question about the siloing, the narrowing of the indications, because they're so specialized. Does that hurt the development? And yes, it does, because there are many indications that could be pursued that aren't, because the economics aren't there, or at least they don't think they're there from the beginning on a piece of paper. Sometimes those things are pursued and they'll find out that, oh, we actually made something that can treat this and this and this and this, but we never would have looked at it unless we thought the economics were right to move forward on that first small indication. But for some of the larger companies that are already well-funded, have R&D, so not the one-hit wonder biotech company that's struggling and has one idea, all the other ones that have an actual R&D program, they can go into these smaller indications, and actually with the intent of honestly running it as a loss when you amortize the R&D, because the intent is that it will actually work in a number of other things. And usually that's the case. Sometimes it's not, but usually it is. And so you do end up getting drugs that come out that are very potent, very effective in tiny indication, and it doesn't work in a lot of other things, but it can find a business and find its spot within there. And I'll give you an example. There are several lung cancer drugs that are out to treat a driver mutation, meaning it is a single spot mutation that makes your cancer cancer. And that is what's driving its replication. And there are several drugs that have come out to treat specific tiny errors in your lung cancer that are very specific. And it only affects 1%, 2% of the entire lung cancer population, yet those drugs were developed. And they charge a lot of money for them. So it actually does work out. And fortunately, we have a system that you can develop niche indications and get compensated for it. And it's important that we do, because many of those niche discoveries in how to treat a rare cancer turns into something much, much larger down the road, or something that is combinable with other cancer drugs that are used to treat a wide population. And it's really great that our country has the vision to help in that manner, with the understanding that this is very, very important to the population. We want new drugs. We want excellent drugs. We want to live very long and very well. And so I applaud our Congress for not going down the national healthcare route, because in the event that that happened, and maybe I'm speaking a little politics here, but in the event that that happened, you could essentially say goodbye to the vast majority of innovation in the US, and for that matter, the rest of the world.
That brings us somewhat full circle back to the importance of the Susan G. Komen Foundation and the support that it provides, right? And so we've been thrilled to have the opportunity to partner where proceeds from the management of the funds that Michael's involved with will be going directly to the Susan G. Komen Foundation. Simplify is making a significant guaranteed donation associated with that. We're thrilled to support it. But effectively what Mike is describing is a situation where there will be many non-economic outcomes associated with cancer research and development as we get narrower and narrower in this process. But it brings us back to effectively what Victoria was highlighting with we need to find ways of continuing to support people who are doing innovative research in this area, right? One way is to have a healthcare system that is capable of reimbursing for small treatment type options. But the other is through charitable investments that allow that research to continue. And, I think that's a great place for us to actually kind of start to wrap up. Victoria, when you think about exactly this dynamic, I mean, it feels to me that this is not a problem that goes away. Exactly as Michael's highlighting, like it almost becomes more important to become focused in providing the resources and research to the community that facilitates that type of, in many situations, non-economic development. Maybe you could comment as we wrap up this general idea.
A couple things I want to say about that, and thank you for that question. We need a very healthy biomedical research enterprise to continue to find these new therapies, put these new ideas of target in play, and contribute to this enormous drug development commercial entity that we have here. It takes a lot of investment, a lot of iterative investment along the way to make this happen. That's the role that Komen plays. Huge piece that we do is helping young investigators, young scientists who've got that innovative idea, and to become that next groundbreaking leader who has this big idea. Some of the people in Komen's investment portfolio include the doctor who has created tamoxifen, or the scientist who actually identified and characterized the Angelina Jolie gene. These are the scientists who look to Komen, who made those early investments and continued investment to keep that thinking going. You have to think of fighting cancer like needing a continual supply of water at a house fire. You just don't go with one tank because you never know what you're going to be faced with. You have to have a continuous pipeline to fight this disease. And that's really important for us to continue to invest in. That's the role that we play. But it's also important, as I said earlier, that we ensure that every patient can access all of this amazing groundbreaking discovery that we are supporting. It requires a lot of educating our elected officials about how to break down barriers to care. It does require a lot of safety net services that Komen itself provides to ensure connection to care. But overall, the investment needs for future biomedical discovery still needed, and Komen still wants to be a part of seeding that future for our breast cancer patients. So thank you for helping us make that happen.
Well, and we are thrilled that we were able to participate in that and help. I'm so excited to have my friend Mike Taylor helming the partnership that we have together. And I really look forward to seeing how this develops over the next year and much longer for that standpoint. I'm very excited about it. We'll let Brian wrap up. He's put on his Mike Taylor blazer, and he looks good.
All right, that was such an awesome and important conversation. It definitely gives me a lot of optimism about the progress in finding cures within healthcare. So if you want more information about Susan G. Komen, please visit and donate at komen.org. And for more information about Simplify, including what we're doing with the Komen organization, Mike mentioned this, but we've got some good information on our website, which is simplify.us. And then look for a follow-up email from us, and we'll have some information about the next episode of Keeping It Simple. But thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and especially thank you to Victoria, Michael, and Michael. This was a really wonderful conversation.